Critical update alert. This is breaking, and it affects every XRP holder. If you hold only 200 XRP, this could be the moment that decides whether your position becomes legendary or simply forgotten. Because what's coming isn't hype. It's a mathematical choke point. In the next 60 seconds, you're going to want to hang tight, because what I'm about to show you might be the last time this price looks remotely affordable. At the time of recording, XRP is trading around 303, but it's not the price that matters anymore. It's the supply dynamic quietly setting up underneath it. This is not financial advice. Always do your own research. Here's the truth almost nobody's talking about. While most holders are fixated on price predictions, the real story is the disappearance of liquid XRP across the market. We've entered the era where every new partnership, every regulatory filing, every corridor activation doesn't just signal adoption, and it absorbs supply. Ripple's moves aren't expanding circulation, they're constricting it, and that's what changes everything. Think of XRP like oxygen in a sealed room. At first, there's plenty to go around. But as the room fills with institutions, banks, and tokenized assets, that oxygen gets consumed faster than it can be replenished. And once it's gone, once supply dries up, even the smallest amount left in your wallet becomes exponentially more valuable. Ripple's rollout across Africa is the first visible phase of this. Most people see Africa and think developing market, but insiders see sandbox. Ripple's RLUSD, its dollar-backed stablecoin, is now powering real-world payments through Cyphercast, Valor, and Yellowcard. That's not experimentation. That's proof of scalability. Every corridor that goes live traps XRP inside operational pipelines for liquidity provision. Those tokens aren't coming back onto exchanges. They're in use, permanently cycling between businesses, banks, and remittance networks. Now layer on what's happening at home. Ripple has filed for a U.S. banking charter, a Federal Reserve master account, and a national trust bank license. That's not crypto ambition. That's entry into the core of the American financial system. And when that integration completes, the XRP required to sustain daily flows between banks will not be available to you or me. It will be locked as reserve liquidity inside institutional systems. Here's where things get truly wild. And it's the part that almost no retail investor grasps yet. XRP's total supply is fixed at 100 billion tokens, roughly. Half are in circulation, but within that half, a shrinking percentage is actually liquid. Every corridor, every custody integration, every treasury contract siphons more tokens into functional reserves. It's not speculation, it's math. Liquidity provisioning doesn't sell coins, it uses them. The same way oil is consumed to run an engine, XRP is consumed by utility demand. Once those flows start scaling across continents, retail accessible supply evaporates. And here's the signal that tells us the countdown has already begun. Ripple's swell conference lineup this year looks like a central banker's dream team. NASDAQ, Citi, BlackRock, BNY Mellon, Fidelity, JP Morgan, CME Group. Those are the institutions that control liquidity. When that caliber of player shows up, it's not to explore, it's to integrate. And integration means demand. Real operational demand that never goes back into circulation. So if you're holding just 200 XRP, the question isn't, will it hit $10? It's how many tokens will actually be left on the open market when the system flips on. Because right now, the math says we're approaching the moment when available supply crosses the adoption curve. The exact point where scarcity becomes reflexive. The fewer coins available, the higher the cost of entry. The higher the cost, the faster institutions move to secure their positions. That's the scarcity feedback loop. You can already see it in the on-chain data. Exchange balances are at multi-year lows. Ripple's escrow releases are immediately offset by corridor allocations. Even retail withdrawals to private custody are trending upward as holders realize the long game. It's a perfect storm of diminishing float and accelerating use. That's why every number counts now. 200 XRP may sound small, but in an environment where the liquid float could drop below 1 billion tokens globally, that's ownership in a global settlement layer. Once financial institutions plug in fully, they won't need to buy from retail. They'll source directly from Ripple or secondary institutional pools, meaning the open market phase could end faster than anyone expects. Stay tuned, because in the next section we'll break down exactly how this supply choke point forms, from custody migration to regulatory capture, and how it transforms XRP from a speculative asset into the fuel of a digital liquidity network. The countdown isn't years away, it's already ticking. Wait, before we go any deeper, ask yourself this. What happens when the entire financial system needs XRP liquidity, and there's barely any left on? Exchanges, that's not a theory. It's a countdown that's already started ticking. The difference between the ones who profit and the ones who panic will come down to timing and understanding what I'm about to show you next. Here's where the numbers start tightening. In traditional finance, liquidity is meant to circulate. But with XRP, liquidity is designed to compress. Every time a corridor goes live, that liquidity gets pulled from open markets into closed loops between banks, fintechs, and remittance hubs. It's like water rerouted from rivers into underground pipelines, still moving but no longer visible on the surface. Ripple's expansion into Africa wasn't just a testbed, it was a rehearsal for global scale. When RLUSD, Ripple's stablecoin, moves value across countries through partners like Valor and Yellowcard, XRP acts as the settlement lubricant. Those tokens don't come back onto exchanges afterward. They stay in motion, trapped in perpetual usage. Multiply that by every region Ripple's onboarding, Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, and you start seeing the supply curve invert. And now we add the custody choke. Ripple's banking charter filings with the OCC and the Federal Reserve aren't just regulatory milestones. They're doorways into segregated custody. When institutions begin holding XRP for operational liquidity, they do so under strict capital and reserve requirements. Those holdings become non-circulating, permanently absorbed. This is how scarcity begins silently, not from hype, but from infrastructure. Let's visualize it. Imagine there are only 10 million liquid XRP left for open market trading. Then Ripple locks 2 million for corridors, 3 million for custody partners, and another 1 million migrates to private wallets. Suddenly, the tradable pool is 40% smaller, but demand didn't fall. It grew. That's how supply shocks form, invisibly, gradually, and then all at once. Now here's the mechanical trigger. As liquidity compresses, spreads widen. That's trader talk for fewer tokens available, higher slippage. When an institution needs to move 500 million through an exchange with thin books, they don't slowly buy, they take the market. That creates a sudden vertical repricing event, what most people mistake for a pump. In reality, it's a liquidity gap filling in. And that's why timing matters so much right now, because the mathematical choke point isn't set by hype. It's set by usage velocity. The faster corridors go live, the faster usable supply vanishes. We've already seen this happen before in traditional commodities. Think palladium in 2021. Demand outpaced supply, inventories dropped, and the price tripled in weeks. XRP could face the same dynamic on a global digital scale. That brings us to the core question: when does this scarcity countdown hit zero? The answer lies in how quickly institutions move from testing to transacting. The minute Ripple's banking approvals finalize, every partner waiting on compliance clearance will flip the switch simultaneously. That's when demand spikes, not over months, but in days. If that happens, even small holders, the ones with just a few hundred XRP, could be sitting on assets that institutions literally can't buy back without triggering a supply squeeze. If you're enjoying this content, make sure that you like and subscribe this video. It really helps me get the message to the masses and is greatly appreciated. Because in the next section, we're going to look at what happens inside the market once scarcity becomes visible. The migration of tokens from exchanges into custody, the psychology of panic sellers, and the setup for what could be the fastest revaluation event in XRP's history. Here's where things get interesting. Once the countdown starts showing up on charts, once exchange supply visibly drops, everything about how the market behaves begins to change. Imagine the XRP ecosystem as a massive lake. For years, water flowed freely. Traders could scoop out liquidity whenever they wanted. But now, those flows are being redirected into underground channels, banking corridors, stablecoin rails, institutional custody. The surface still looks calm, but underneath that water is draining out of sight. That's exactly what's happening to XRP right now. Exchanges are showing multi-year lows in wallet balances. Tokens are migrating to Ripple-linked liquidity hubs, ODL corridors, and institutional vaults that never feed coins back into public markets. Retail holders can't see it, but they're standing at the edge of a shrinking shoreline. And yet, here's the irony. As supply vanishes, most retail investors will sell. Why? Because they mistake quiet for weakness. They'll say, XRP is not moving. Maybe it's dead. That's phase one of the scarcity cycle. Seeding liquidity. Smart money accumulates while noise traders get bored. Then comes rail activation. The moment those corridors actually start moving real volume, that's when liquidity gets consumed. Finally, institutional dominance, when banks, funds, and payment giants absorb what's left. By that point, it's no longer a speculative market, it's infrastructure. You're seeing the first signs already. Ripple's Swell Conference isn't a hype festival. It's a roster of liquidity controllers. NASDAQ, Citi, BNY Mellon, Fidelity, BlackRock, JP Morgan. These are not speculative attendees. They're the institutions that define how and where global liquidity moves. When they step in, they don't trade, they allocate. And this is where most retail traders miss the real story. They assume price will rise first, and then institutions will follow. But the truth, it's the opposite. Institutions move first, quietly. They take positions while price feels flat. By the time retail sees the breakout, the allocations are already done. So when people say XRP is boring, that's the perfect setup. It's the silence before structural repricing. The boring phase is when the foundations lock in, and when the patient holders separate themselves from the crowd. Now let's add another layer. Custody migration. You've probably heard about Ripple's filings for a national trust bank license. What that really means is that XRP could soon be custodied the same way institutions hold T-bills or treasuries, in federally regulated capital-compliant vaults. Once that happens, circulating supply becomes fragmented. Tokens in institutional custody aren't part of retail float anymore. It's like splitting the market into two layers: the surface market, where traders speculate, and the deep market, where settlement happens. Once the deep market activates, the surface market becomes a thin veneer, small, fast, and reactive. Prices move violently not because of hype, but because depth vanishes. That's when volatility flips from threat to opportunity. Holders who understood what they owned early, the ones sitting quietly on a few hundred or a few thousand XRP, suddenly find themselves holding a scarce settlement asset in the middle of a liquidity migration. Here's the second awakening moment: the realization that this isn't a hype cycle, it's a handoff. From retail to institutional control, from speculation to settlement, from public markets to private rails, that transition always feels like nothing is happening until everything is. And just before that point of no return, there's usually one final phase: panic supply. The last wave of retail holders sell to take profits before the real revaluation begins. It's the same playbook that repeats across every major technological adoption curve in history: electricity, internet, AI, and now money itself. So if you're wondering how this story ends, don't blink. Because in the next section, we'll zoom all the way out, connecting Ripple's global strategy, the US banking integration, and the macro timing that could flip XRP from undervalued digital asset to global liquidity standard. And here's where it all converges. Every corridor, every filing, every quiet partnership, it's all leading to one irreversible outcome: XRP becoming the backbone of digital liquidity. This isn't about hype anymore. It's about infrastructure. The rails are built, the regulators are aligned, and the institutions are preparing to move. The moment Ripple's US banking license clears, the system flips from speculation to operation. At that point, the market won't chase price. It'll chase access. The ones holding even 200 XRP will own a piece of digital real estate that can't be recreated or replaced. Because when the liquidity switch turns on and supply vanishes into corridors and custody, there's no going back. The countdown isn't years away. It's already ticking. And when it hits zero, the only question left will be, were you positioned or were you watching? If you're interested in what 800 XRP would look like in your life, make sure you check that video out from my archive. It will really blow your mind. As always, all information in this video is not financial advice, and please do your own research and consult with a professional. Like and subscribe this video, it'd greatly appreciated. Make sure you don't miss the next critical update, and I'll see you on the next one.